Hello, welcome to Theories of Addictions. This is week 4, and we're looking at the general behavioral model. But today, this is in lecture 2, I'm going to be looking at the behavioral model applied specifically to addiction. So remember everything we said about the behavioral model from lecture 1. One thing I want to start with is that the behavioral model helps explain addictive behavior with respect to 3 primary factors. And those are, and then I'll elaborate on them, but I'll just mention them first. One is the availability of substances, lack of reinforcement for healthy alternative behaviors, and lack of punishment for the initial use of a substance, not necessarily subsequent uses. But let's look at availability of substances. This is problematical because I'm talking about the context in the United States. Society tries to make the substance unavailable through laws, etc., but it's still highly available. But there is some tendency to want to kind of clamp down socially and legally upon the availability of the substance, try to make that more unavailable to the individuals in the hope that they will not subsequently become addicted. With respect to lack of reinforcement for healthy alternative behaviors, what we see is that some potential alternative behaviors, alternatives to addictive behavior, are not rewarded adequately. And so they may be in place, there may be some, but the reward may not be maximized. Some of those may be family fun times. And so in the culture, let's say the family, during COVID, it was very difficult for families sometimes. Or even, in non-pandemic times, if both parents really need to work and they are exhausted, etc., then a family fun time may not be maximized. And so often behavior is not rewarded through family fun time. Or hobbies, or even doing exercise, which would be a great alternative. Studying, of course, as a professor, I really advocate that one. But maybe that one doesn't provide adequate healthy behavior. It may not, be as exciting or as available in some ways for engaging in the addictive behavior. Or let's say attending religious activities or something like that. So drug behavior, on the other hand, is rewarded in very immediate ways, whereas some of those other ones, like studying, may be rewarded, but the reward you may get is down the line, right? And so the drug, though, may give you a reward by immediately relieving the anxiety that the individual has, or it may help them feel calm, or they may experience happiness, or they may find themselves more outgoing and they get social benefit and social reinforcement as a result of that. So those other alternatives may not give immediate or as powerful a reward as the drug seems to do. So that can be problematical, right? And third would be the lack of punishment for the initial use of the substance. The lack of punishment is only gradually experienced, typically after the addiction is full-blown, okay? So the individual may not experience punishment until they're in the throes of the addiction. They may not experience it initially. So what would be punishment? Well, the poor health of the addict, or the physical pain of withdrawal, or even incarceration in jail or prison, which is a punisher. But often those don't occur early in the addiction. They may increase the likelihood over time. Okay. And there are very specific reinforcers for drug use. And these are very important for us to know what these reinforcers are, because therapy is going to need to address that. And we're going to have to look at, in this week, in this lecture, then how does behaviorism respond to this? There are reinforcers for drug use, but already the behavioral model knows that there are rewards and punishers, or reinforcers and punishers. So it would have us alert ourselves to what those reinforcers are for that individual and what the punishers are, excuse me. One reinforcer for the use of drugs is the client experiences euphoria. Now, the amount of euphoria, the good feeling that they experience, may be very drug specific. So for example, cocaine gives euphoria really, really quickly and much more intense than alcohol would give euphoria. So cocaine would be more proficient at that. There may be some desired social consequences as a result of using it. In other words, there may be a community around the use of a substance. So for example, in the United States, there's a whole community around, with ritual and all kinds of things around the use of marijuana or cannabis, right? So engaging in that social context is a reward there too. So the same thing with alcohol. It's there's some kind of reward, social reward for that. That we kind of make jokes about the the business lunches or the business dinners where there's always alcohol present. We make fun of that. It's not always true, but there is a social consequence for engaging in that. Or there is the elimination of pain and sickness of withdrawal. Let's say the individual is in the midst of withdrawing from a substance and they take this substance and then they feel better. So that's going to be very drug specific too. So let's say you're addicted to heroin, then if you are abstaining from the heroin, then that's a pretty intense physical and emotional pain that an individual experiences. Really sick. It's not a pleasant experience to go through. Much different than if someone begins to refrain from the use of marijuana, okay? I'm not advocating one over the other. I'm just talking about that there are reinforcers for the use of drugs, and that the degree of reinforcement and the context of the reinforcement may be different from one drug to another drug. So here's the another thing is that refraining from the use of a drug, we have found within behavioral research that refraining from drug use doesn't necessarily cause the experience of beneficial consequences until after a really long period of time. Let me say that again, because this is really important for us to realize, because a lot of people think that if we can help the individual just get over the drug use, that they will experience that as immediately beneficial, but that is not necessarily the case. And frequently it isn't the case. That the refrain from the drug use doesn't cause necessarily the experience of the beneficial consequences until after a period of time. Another very important factor that behaviorism has helped us to realize and has tremendous impact upon treatment is on the question of how is physical dependence on a drug related to the development and maintenance of an addiction. So if an individual is physically dependent on a medication, does that cause addiction? Does that maintain the addiction? Really, really important questions that are often assumed rather than actually tested, right? The research is out there, and so it's really important for us to be aware of that research. And we know that physical dependence isn't necessary and it's not sufficient as a cause for addiction. That's important. Let me say that again. Physical dependence is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition to develop a substance use addiction. Okay, some addictions are not stopped when there's relief from withdrawal. Okay, now this is important because we would think that the relief from the withdrawal would be a reinforcer. Okay, that's a big assumption, and it may be, but some addictions to certain medications are not stopped by relief from withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Some people, for example, take pain medications after surgery, or they have an injury and they're on pain medications, but most don't become addicted, right? And so even though there's a positive experience with taking the pain medication, because there's the elimination of, or the diminishing of the pain. So when they come off the pain medication, sometimes there may be some discomfort in weaning off that pain medication, but they don't go actively seeking the drug as we would see within if we had an addiction to that med. So we can't assume that because and the individual may have been kind of physically dependent upon that medication for pain relief, but that doesn't necessarily, as we can see, lead to an addiction. Some addicts, in fact, can be treated with other meds. Methadone, for example, is one of those other meds that would be used to replace a drug to which they're addicted to. So they may be treated with another med to lower the addictive behavior. And even though now they're not physically dependent upon the drug, they still feel addicted to the drug. So the diminishment of the dependency does not make the elimination of the feel of being addicted. So this is rather, what does this point out? It points out that addiction is a really complex phenomenon, and we need to look at the parts of this and look at assumptions that we've had that may be wrong assumptions, and science can help us identify those. Behaviorism can do that. So behaviorism, for example, would expect individuals in early recovery to experience lapse or relapse, okay? Why? Well, we've looked at some of those factors, and so we can so we can make some hypotheses, and indeed they find that these are validated. One is that as the person is in recovery, one fact is drugs are readily available. The addict knows where they are and they know how to obtain them, right? So that's there. That hasn't gone away. And then the other thing is that the reinforcers for, moving away from the addiction or stopping to use the substance may take some time. So for example, let's say the individual has been addicted to a substance over a period of time, and as a result of that may have lied to the family or stolen money from the family, etc. So the family's trust in the individual has gone down. So they stop the use of the substance, but the trust doesn't come back immediately. So the benefit doesn't come back immediately. It's not as though the parents are going to say, or the rest of the family is going to say, yeah, I fully trust you now. That wouldn't be realistic, okay? Because they may have trusted before and then their trust got violated, and so that's going to take some time. Or getting a job. You may have gone off the medication, you may have gone off the drug, but maybe it may take some time for you to get a job, or especially a job that's emotionally satisfying for you, because during the time that the individual was taking the drug, they may have not invested in having a really of working. So there may be gaps in the resume, etc. So it may take some time to do that. So the reinforcer of having the job may take a little bit of time. Or It may take some time to create a group of friends who are not using, because the individuals who were not users may have dropped away and not have, have not been in friendship relationships with you for some time. So it may take a while to build the friends that would be a social reinforcer. Or the consequences, perhaps, of breaking the law as a result of being addicted to a substance may take some time to get resolved through the courts, etc. So those reinforcers are not immediate, like the immediate effect of the drug use. There's another factor that's really important to look at, and this is what's called delay discounting. When behavioral reinforcers are delayed. So, for example, the individual stops using something, and then there's a delay in receiving the reinforcer. Because of the delay, the reinforcer is less effective in changing the behavior. If the reward was immediate, then we would see more of an impact upon changing the behavior. And so if there's a delay in the reinforcer, that delay in the reinforcer may cause some uncertainty on the part of the addict about the experience, the positive experience, okay? There is uncertainty about those consequences, right? So that's really, really important for us to realize. So what happens? Well, all of us, whether we're addicted to a substance or not, tend to choose immediate rewards over delayed rewards. This is part of what parenting, etc., and going to school and all of those kinds of things are involved in, or in playing in sports, or any number of things, is that we learn to delay gratification. That's part of maturation. And but there are individuals that take some time to learn that. We all do, to be quite honest. I mean, honestly, if I see a piece of chocolate cake, I want immediate gratification for that. I'm diabetic, so that's probably not a good idea for me to go with my immediate gratification. But the taste of that chocolate cake is an immediate reward for me. Refraining from that and having a salad is not an immediate reward for me. So I have to do some work and develop some habits, right? So that I will choose healthy foods over, processed carbs with lots of sugar in them. Okay, I'm not perfect at that. I'll just be quite honest for that. So we all tend to choose immediate rewards, but it is really important that we learn how to delay gratification. And part of this is due to impulsivity. And we do know that part of impulsivity can be a personality trait. So certain individuals have more difficulty in not being impulsive. Now, again, part of maturation, I always say part of maturation growing up is learning to have an impulse rather than be an impulse. If you ever watched a little kid, and they don't know people are watching them, and they may just have an impulse to throw their arm up in the air or spin around or do something. And so they'll just do it. They are their impulse. They'll just go with it. It takes some time to have the impulse and not do it. If I have an impulse to spin around or throw my arm up, which I rarely do anymore, but if I did that, I probably wouldn't do it because of social consequences maybe of doing that. So that impulsivity may be maturational, but it also may be a personality trait. There are just individuals who are more impulsive, but they have kind of healthy impulsivity that brings them great rewards. But there are those individuals where the impulsivity can get them into some trouble, or there are impulse control disorders. And certain behaviors are impulsive. For example, drug use and some juvenile delinquency, and even suicide itself can be highly impulsive. So impulsivity is something that we need to look at when we're looking at drug addiction. So one of the things that we do, that we borrow from behavioral model, is this thing called Behavioral modification. Excuse me. Behavioral modification is also called contingency management. So just remember that. Behavioral modification and contingency management are synonymous. This is what we actually discussed in lecture 1 for this week 4. And so contingency management or behavioral modification, we're going to modify a deleterious or maladaptive behavior, right? And that begins with identifying the maladaptive substance use of behavior. So that we will look at identification of that. And then, just as we talked about in the first lecture, we're going to analyze the rewards and punishers that are surrounding that addictive behavior. And then we're going to try to make changes in the environment, right, in all of those parts that are involved in that, right, to help change the behavior. And then what we'll do is measure the behavioral change. So all those things that we learned in the first lecture are applicable here in behavioral modification when we're treating the individual who has an addictive substance use addiction. Your text looks at 6 different steps in contingency management approaches to address addictive behavior. One, and this is an amplification of what we just said, excuse me, is to identify those maladaptive behaviors. Again, focus on the behavior. Here the behavior is the use of the substance. Then collaborate with the client to change the environment, which may involve learning some skills to help them, help them change the environment. Skills about what to say, what to do, all those kinds of things. Then we're going to need to set some realistic, measurable behavioral goals. If we think that someone who has a heroin addiction is going to get over that in a week and a half, that's not a realistic goal. Or even if someone has a substance use disorder and a co-occurring disorder with it, like depression, to think that they're going to overcome the depression and be happy in a few weeks is not a realistic goal. It might be more realistic to go from depression to kind of sadness. Both of those are negative emotions. They don't feel good. But you can be more functional with sadness than you could with depression. So we might want to move them toward a helpful negative goal rather than an unhelpful negative goal, okay? And then we will arrange the reinforcers and the behaviors so that the client can experience it. The reinforcers for abstaining or diminishing drug use, and then punishments likewise. We can help them set up social support networks. Remember Bandura's work on modeling. So if we can help them set up those social networks, that would be tremendously important. Why? Because one of the reinforcers is social connection, but the connections were connections that were tied to the drug often and were not really helpful. So we need to have a better social support network. And then help the client to make a commitment to change. And then also look at the barriers of change. Now, next week, we will be looking at that in great detail. So I'm not going to be looking at what we do with the level of commitment the client has to change. But that is a tremendously important issue that is tied to motivation that we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to use contingency management in one thing is use contingency management in moderation-oriented controlled drinking treatment. Now, this is, let me just say, the contingency management, use of contingency management toward moderation-oriented, like controlling the use of a substance, controlling or diminishing the alcohol, rather than full abstinence, has not been historically popular in the United States. It's been more popular in Canada and in Europe, etc. And but it is getting more growing awareness in the United States. Is it Is it effective? Yeah, there's some research that it is effective for some people and not effective for others. Okay, there may be times when it might be possible to use moderation-oriented treatment, and there are times when it's definitely not a good idea to do that. So it tends not to be a good idea or a good model if the following are present. One, if the individual is a real severe addict, then that's probably not going to be the best way to approach that for reasons that we'll talk about in another week. The other one might be because of the individual preference. The individual may say, I don't want to have anything else to do with this substance use. I want to engage in abstinence only. Well, if that's their position, then that's the form of treatment then that we would probably want to begin with that particular client. There also may be some actual physical impairments or diseases due to using the substance. So for example, if they've been an alcoholic for, they have an alcohol substance use disorder and they've had that over a long period of time, then there may be some, liver involvement, etc. So drinking more might cause some more physical problems. So the moderation approach might not be warranted in that case. That's a medical determination that would need to be made there. If they have a physical illness, the meds they take maybe for the physical illness might be negatively impacted by the substance. So even if they're trying to moderate the substance, there's still some negative impact. So for example, let's say that someone has panic attacks and they're taking short-term benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepine and, for example, the use of alcohol is quite dangerous. So it might, in that case, moderation approach might not be warranted. If the individual with the substance use disorder is a female and she's pregnant, then obviously that's not a good idea to take that moderation approach. Or if the individual tends to lose control when they've had even a little bit of the substance, right? There's no brakes on the use of that. Some people say, if I have one drink, then there's no going back. And so if that's the case, then that moderation approach may not be a great idea. There are some abstinence programs out there that have been effective. Now, you may think that because we've looked at when it may not be warranted to look at a moderation approach and that there are results talking about abstinence approach, that I'm against a moderation approach, or et cetera. I'm going to go with the science and what the scientific research says. So I would look at all of that data to inform any opinion I would have as a therapist. There are some abstinence programs out there, and your text goes into those in some great detail, so I encourage you to read those. Another kind of approach that is very much tied to behaviorism that has had great success, particularly in the lowering of or the elimination of the use of cocaine, is a voucher system. So often these are helpful if they've done in a social environment, for example, in a community setting. So they may have vouchers so that if you stay cocaine free, and they may do tests to see whether you've used it or not, right? Urine test or whatever. So then, or any substance, then if you do abstain from the use of that, then you have vouchers that then you can use to get some things that you want in the in the society. Any number of vouchers for rewarding behavior. Okay, and they found that that's actually quite helpful. Okay, so again, read more about that voucher system so you can see some of the techniques that are used are highly based upon the behavioral model. And so I do encourage you to, again, if you haven't studied behaviorism for some time, go back and read it in, like an introductory text. Your textbook doesn't go into great detail on the behavioral model. It kind of assumes that you know some of it, but it does give you enough to at least understand the impact of that model when it comes to the treatment of substance use disorder. So thank you. I hope that was helpful, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
I plan to use my degree ultimately just to help people. I'm here to find out specifically what demographic that is.
The professors really take the time to look at the courses and how they're going to prepare us to be counselors.
I'm just really excited to get to learn from these people that have so much experience in this field.
It's obvious that they have a passion for what they're doing, not just because they enjoy it, but because they know they're investing in someone else, and that's most important to me.
I ultimately chose CIU because of the community. I love the fact that I know that I will be with the same people for the next 3 years.
We have a time during our classes where we get to be in small groups, and that allows us to get to know each other and to support one another and to learn together. I feel like I'm right where I need to be, and I'm grateful to get to be a part of this program.